let's officially kick this off so we can make good use of our hour together. So it's a new season. Labor Day is behind us. It's September. Fall is upon us, which means in Texas, it's a nice and crisp 98 degrees rather than 103. And Ed, that's 35 Celsius for you. So, but with fall comes a new series of Saturate webinars, and I am excited to learn and glean from these bi-weekly conversations around the theme Church of the Future. So just to kind of lay the foundation for the whole series this fall, a lot of folks have thought that COVID-19 ushered in a whole new era for the church in North America and beyond. But then others are asking, has it? Has it actually ushered in a whole new era? Because church leaders and researchers and missiologists and everyday followers of Jesus are increasingly saying, maybe COVID has merely just shined a light on the trajectory that our culture and our churches have already been on. And so this can be an opportunity for us to respond more overtly to things that have been going on more subtly. But the question is, how do we respond? What must we do? What can we do? And so this fall, we're going to talk with some of those leaders and researchers and missiologists and everyday followers of Jesus across North America and beyond about missional communities of the future. We're Soma and Saturate, and so that's something we talk about a lot. We'll talk about local churches of the future, living on mission in the future, if anything's going to change there, and leader development of the future. But today, I am thrilled to kick off the whole series with my friend Daniel Yang, as we look at the realities and priorities and changes and trends in the broader North American church of the future. So there's a little bit of a long intro to lay foundation for the series, but Daniel, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely, Ben. I really appreciate our friendship, learning from you. For all you who maybe have not read my bio, I direct what's called the Sen Institute. But prior to that, I was a church planter out in Toronto, and see some folks here in Canada as well. And then prior to that, I was in Dallas-Fort Worth, where Ben was at. So Ben was in Fort Worth, or is in Fort Worth, and I was in one of the suburbs out there on staff at a church with Bob Roberts, who's a mentor to both of us. And so I think that's where our relationship began, was with when we were working with Bob.
Yeah.
And you were always the smart guy that Bob worked with. So Ben was always Ben was the professor, the smart dude that Bob was working with. And so that's why he wrote with you and not with some of us. So
that's funny. Well, you're getting your PhD right now.
Yeah,
so
well, maybe I'm just avoiding, real life, and I'm.
Yeah, that's funny.
And
I'll go beyond. Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I was gonna say, part of what we do at the Sen Institute is we do research a little bit of what does it look like to plant churches right now. So we do some best practices, but a lot of what we're curious about is really the changes that need to happen in order to, and I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, in order to prepare ourselves, our organizations, networks, denominations, to plant churches better for the future. So I'm really excited to have this conversation today.
Yeah, and I'll go beyond Daniel's bio as well a little bit. He's a great guy. He's a husband and a dad. He is working on a PhD. Songwriter, worship leader. You can find Facebook videos of his acoustic covers of Coldplay songs, among other things.
Those are only made for creative breaks when I don't want to do my PhD homework.
Anyway, so I'm excited. Thank you for making the time to join us. I'm going to pray for us. And some folks are already starting to ask some questions. We'll come to your questions toward the end. But I'm going to pray and then give the floor to Daniel, who's prepared a little bit. Conversation starter for us. So Father, we thank you for today. We thank you that you are the head of your church. You're the head of your church in North America in 2020, and you're the head of your church globally for all of history. I thank you for the ways that you have proven yourself time and time again, and that all your promises are yes and amen in Christ, through in some ways far harder things that our generation didn't experience, but generations before us experienced. And I thank you that you're doing the same, and that your mission is going forward, and that your church is thriving in some ways, and being purified in some ways, even during this unique and overt season that we're in with COVID. as Daniel and I were praying before, God, we just want to lift up this idea that you might use this hour that we have together to produce disproportionate fruit in churches and participants and those who are joining in all across North America and beyond. Would you be our teacher? Would you be our leader? Spirit, would you go ahead of anything Daniel and I talk about, and soften hearts and open eyes to what you're doing? And would you cause us to be willing to follow you into responses, changes, things that are hard, because they're already hard. So would this be an hour of worship that we get to have together? It's in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Well, thanks, Ben. What I want to do for maybe the next 10 minutes or so is just to provide some basic foundation or a framework to think about what the church in North America may look like in the future. Now, obviously, none of us are prophets. I mean, you may be gifted prophetically, but you can't tell anybody what the church is going to look like. In some ways, I think I agree with the futurist. His name is Paul Saffel. He works out of Stanford University, and he says really the best way for us to think about the corner or the bend around the future is to look as far back or twice as far back as you want to look into the future. So if we want to look 20 years in the future, maybe we should study what the last 40 years look like. And so trends and realities are probably the most important thing for us to pay attention to when we talk about the future. But obviously, in some ways we do know the future because the book of Revelation has been written. And so Jesus wins, the church prevails, the kingdom comes to earth. And so in some ways, I'm a huge, fan of N.T. Wright and some of these things. And so we do know that the church is working alongside what God is doing, and he is going to establish his purposes. But for the intents and purposes of what we're talking about today, I do want to provide some basic sociological things for us to understand as we're looking at how to plant churches better and also how to engage culture. I'm just going to provide like a foundational, and then I expect that in our conversation, Ben, and also in our Q&A, people will kind of pull out some of the implications. And then specifically, if you want to dive deep into anything about COVID, we've spent a lot of time researching the last 6 months, how pastors are responding, how churches are doing. We can dig into some of that stuff as well. But let me share my screen for a second here, just to give you some visuals here. One of the things that I like to just talk about is why the year 2050 is significant, why we should think about the year 2050. And so part of this is because 2050 for the US Census and for a lot of organizations, it is a benchmark year for how we think about the future. If you've read anything about the demographic trends of the United States, you've come across a guy named William Frey. He is the leading demographer for Brookings Institute. He happened to be my sociology professor at the University of Michigan. And he wrote a fantastic book called Diversity Explosion, and they actually just came out with a second edition, I think. And the book is talking about how diversity is happening so quickly in the United States. And by the year 2050, actually the census predicts between 2042 and 45-ish, U.S. will, for the first time in history, have no majority race. In that book, Frey goes into a lot of the in-depth implications for organizations and institutions to understand how demographic changes will actually affect the way that you lead your institutions. Some of the conversations we have today around being a multi-ethnic church is an implication around some of these realities. If you think back to this 1985, in the 80s and early 90s, the U.S. was still largely 80-ish% white. And we're in 2020 today, where that percentage has been reduced to almost 60-ish%. And by the time we get to 2040, 2042, it's going to be less than 50%. Fastest growing demographic is actually amongst, in terms of like growth rate, is Asians, women in particular. So this happens to be, we see some of these trends. Kamala Harris is obviously African-American, but also she identifies with her Asian heritage. And then we also know that the largest birth cohort is, in terms of the largest race that's having children, are Latino and Hispanic speaking people. So many implications for the future as we think about that. Some of the things that we should probably think about is also the national narratives that are emerging no longer make church decline language a motivator for mission. What do I mean by that? Like the idea that, there used to be more people in church, that idea is not going to motivate people into missions in the same way that it did in the last 40 years. We see this already in Europe. I mean, if you talk to European church planting organizations, the idea of church attendance is not a motivator for mission. And so the narratives that we've used predominantly around church planting and around church growth is somewhat expiring, or at least it's only become one lane in which we motivate people to do missions and church planting. And then some of these are a little bit morbid. I don't mean to discourage anybody, especially, this is, again, I don't want to be accused of ageism. I'm talking just about realities here. But by 2050, baby boomers are gone. Like, I mean, yeah, we just won't have any more baby boomers. Gen X, yeah, those who are really those that have pioneered like networks. If you think about Exponential, if you think about Soma, Saturate, these organizations, these networks, fantastic in our time. Those folks, Ben, I don't know how old you are. You may be a Zennial like me. But if you're Jeff Vanderstelt, if you're at Stetzer, if you're John and Dave Ferguson, you're all probably retiring, maybe dead too. Sorry, they're our friends. I don't mean to be morbid, but 2050, most of us will probably be with Jesus at that point. But millennials, who's been all the rage for the last 10, 15 years, they'll be retiring. And then Gen Z, which is my kids, I've got a range of a 19-year-old all the way down to 2. I'm a father of 5. They'll be entering into their 50s. And I don't know if they will inherit the institutions in the churches that we are currently leading. But these are realities. These are not just trends, but these are realities that is underlying the future of what we'll be talking about. And we haven't even gotten to COVID yet, but these are just things that are already there. I want to help you understand in terms of why church planting is important, especially when we talk about like models of church planting, everything from micro to multi-site to mega, whatever. But there's some missiological reasons for why you want to think about units of churches in terms of like beachheads of doing ministry in communities. But how much church planting do we need to do? Some basic numbers. In 2010, the U.S. population was roughly 309 million. The number of congregations was roughly about 314,000. That's roughly a ratio of 1 to 1,000 people. So there's one church to every 1,000 people. Again, the ratio is important because what it means is that it's theologically and also sociologically, you have a community that's engaging in a particular area. If you fast forward to 2050, the projected minimum population size is 400 million. This is assuming that immigration is at its lowest, birth rates are at its lowest. Minimum US will have a population of 400,000. That means we need about 400,000 congregations to keep up with that ratio of one church to every 1,000 people in the United States. So between the year 2010 and 2050, which is about a 40-year span, we need to net at least 86,000 churches or some version of church congregation in the community. And on average, that means that we need to net, again, that's important. We'll come back to that in a second here, around 2,100 churches per year. So that means that if we want to see that ratio of one church per 1,000 people, that's a lot of church planting that needs to happen. And so what we do know is the best numbers that we have so far, and we're working on updating these numbers, is as of 2014, Lifeway says that we were planting about 400,000 churches and closing about 3,700 churches, which means that we were netting about 300 churches. Now, obviously, there's a lot of population shifting, and people are, larger churches are growing larger, smaller churches are closing. So there's a lot of dynamics there. I totally understand that. What I'm providing for us here is a model to think about capacity, and are we actually planting churches at the same capacity in which our population is growing? And as you look at some of these numbers, you have to me, this is where the burden lies for me, Ben. For every year that we're falling short of getting closer to this net capacity of number of churches to reach the ratio of the population growth, every year that we're not planting this many churches, that burden increases for the next year. and it creates this for the next generation. In some ways, this is almost a generational justice issue. If we're not doing our part now to position and to think about leaders of the future, to set them up to do better in terms of having gospel kingdom communities all over, North America, so that they can reach their communities best, then we're actually ignoring our generational responsibility today. And so I want to use this to kind of prime the pump for our thinking. Again, these models, this is just a model, but I want you to feel burdened the way that I feel burdened, that if we don't try to figure this out to release more in the next generation, then that's a huge burden that we're placing onto them. I want us to think about this also in terms of global Christianity. I think it's so important for us to see this. If you're in cities like Houston, Miami, here in Chicago, for you're seeing probably more than any other parts of the country, the impact of the global church on your city. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason why we're seeing this influx of wonderful Jesus-loving people planting churches, that weren't born in the North American continent, but planting churches. I planted in Toronto, which it has the world's largest diverse ethnic population in the world, with 51% of the people were born outside Canada. And so there's a reason for why we have this influx of immigrants, but not just immigrants, but Christians coming into North America. But this is from the Center for Global Christianity at Boston University, and I think this might be helpful for you to understand some of these things. You're probably familiar with some of these numbers and trends already, but if you just look at the growth of Christianity by continent, you see Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, North America, Oceania, and then on the bottom are the decades. It's not completely to scale. It had to shrink that a little bit. And then the population. So this is the population per continent of Christians. Obviously, it's a very broad definition of Christians that they use at the Center for Global Christianity. But just so you understand, in the at the turn of the 20th century, around 1900s, when modern missions was really kind of like in its, somewhat in the, past its golden heyday, I guess you could say. If you think about, William Carey's in the late 1800s as like the catalyst for modern missions movement, you're probably at about a little bit over 100 years or so at this point. You see that Christianity in Africa, and that's what we're going to really look at, is Africa compared to North America. You see that in Africa, there's about 8.5 million Christians. In North America, there are about 60 million Christians. Largely, North America identified itself as a Christian nation at that point, or had Christian foundations. And so by 1970, you see that there's actually this intersection now where Africa, in the late 1970s, Africa actually now begins to become, as there are as many African Christians as there are in North American Christians. You see this actually trend happen right at the end of the 1970s, early 1980s. You go to the change in the millennium, Africa at this point has by far surpassed North America in terms of the number of Christians. When I say number of Christians, don't just think population. You need to also think the advancement of theology. The advancement of missiology. Most of our missiology that we've talked about in North America is actually our understanding of how the church has grown in Western Africa when it was first engaged. And so the African church, it's theologians. It's not just a numeric quantitative thing. The qualitative church in Africa is strong and it's growing. The churches are larger in Africa than they are here in North America in some cases. And so by this decade, today, there are almost 640 million Christians on the continent of Africa, which is twice the size of the population of North America. And then it just goes up from there. And so by the time we get to 2050, the projections are, according to the Center for Global Christianity, that look at the trend in North America. If we don't do something, look at the trend in North America. We have some growth. You see some of the growth there. But remember, I was telling you, the population of North America by 2050 minimum is about 400 million. according to the Global Center for Global Christianity, the growth rates that we're seeing right now in terms of number of Christians, we're only going to see a slight growth by the time we get to 2050. But look at Africa, and look at Asia, and look at Latin America, and boy, pray for Europe, right? And so I want us to see this is a strong visual for us. Again, the first 6 things that I talked to you about were realities. This here is a reality, but it's also a trend. In some ways, you know this because you've probably read Philip Jenkins and some of these other books. Lamin Sanneh has been saying this for a long time, but the center for Christianity has shifted. We know this, but we don't know this. And so we have still been doing missions based on a paradigm that largely was adapted from the 70s and the 80s. And so, again, this is framing some of the background for our conversation today. So I do want to bring up this point that the global church will be the context from which we reimagine the church in North America. I am a part of the Southern Baptist, and every year when we look at our annual reports, the number of non-Anglo churches that are being planted are always more than 50% of the number of Anglo churches that are being planted. Don't think for a second that that's not going to impact the future of the church. So just a real quick break here. Thought this might be a fun picture to show. This was Dr. Rick Warren is a hero of mine. When I cut my teeth on ministry back in the late 90s, early 2000s, our church entered into purpose-driven curriculum, and so I had a chance to spend a whole day with them. Think about that, a whole day with Dr. Rick Warren. It was an amazing time. And so most people know that he's a hugger, but he's also a kisser. So I just thought this would be fun to show pictures of him for you. But there's a reason why I want to show you a picture of Dr. Rick Warren, and that's because we are closer to 2050 than we are to when Saddleback Church was planted. Think about that. I cut my teeth on ministry based on the Saddleback model, but we're closer to 2050 than when Saddleback Church was planted. So Saddleback was planted in 1980. That's Rick Warren standing in front of his congregation, meeting in the school there. Today, 2020, I couldn't find a better picture. I'm sorry. I hope this is not discouraging, but 2020 is defined by the pandemic, coronavirus crisis. But we are actually closer to this future reality of 2050 than we are to when Rick Warren planted Saddleback Church. And so I just really want that to sink in and really set the tone and conversation for us today. I'm very passionate about this. We're passionate about this at the Sen Institute. Sorry, Ben, a shameless plug. Part of the reason what we do is we put think tanks together, and we have one coming up about missiology and emerging leaders. I won't keep this up for long, but we'll drop it in the chat there. If you're interested in having this conversation with us, I think, Ben, you're going to be a part of this as well. We love to have that conversation with you as well. So I'll stop there, Ben, and then we can jump into our conversation.
No shameless plug there, man. That's the work you guys are doing is good and helpful, and I've been honored to be part of some of those think tanks. So yeah, for sure. If you were on at the beginning, Daniel honored me by saying that I was a smart guy, and if you've been listening for the last 20 minutes, you know that Daniel's a liar, because he is very clearly the one who can compile and put all of those things and communicate them in a clear way. And so I want to pick up from that kind of graph, the trend, but also some of the shifts that you guys have talked about. Like, if this is true, then what are some of the dominoes that fall? What are some of the trends that you were seeing the North American church needing to move toward even before COVID hit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, I know in the midst of the pandemic, there have been multiple layers. I saw a question about politics, which I don't know, maybe we'll get into. But obviously one of the big layers that has always been there, but happened to be exacerbated during in the midst of the COVID pandemic, has been the issues of race. And I mentioned that because of the demographic changes. Now, I don't necessarily believe that demographics is destiny. But if you look at the demographic trends, if you think about this, back in the 50s and 60s, when there was still the remnant of, well, there was definitely Jim Crow still. But then when churches were starting to become integrated, we used I wasn't born yet, but the term that was used at the time was integrated church. By the time you get to the 90s or late 90s, and it really took off probably in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, the term multi-ethnic church began to kind of emerge. Because we started to think about like what would it look like to not just have a black-white binary conversation, but and part of this is because of the Immigration Act that happened in the 70s and 80s that increased the influx of immigrants in North America. So you go from integrated church, which is black and white, not a multi-ethnic church. You see that trend happen over in just about 20 years or so. So this is always going to be a part of the conversation, and I have a whole entire different lecture about, how not to have tokenism when you actually begin thinking about building teams that are multi-ethnic, because it doesn't work when you're just trying to fit like diversity quota. And so I think that's one of the big challenges that we're going to see. And so part of the reason why the church is having a hard time having a conversation about race is we're kind of like, we're still kind of growing in like, what does it mean to have a truly integrated multi-ethnic church leadership? And I don't know how long it's going to take, but it may take several more decades for us to have better models. I do think we have some provable models right now of what multi-ethnic church looks like. But I think by the time we get to churches that are, truly multi-ethnic, we won't even use the term multi-ethnic anymore. Mm-hmm. I think it's and I talked to Mark DeMaz about this. I think he would agree with me that it's a transitional term.
Yeah, that's interesting. For sure. I would love to dive into that. I got to keep us moving on though. We've also, and you and I've had some conversations about like the level of professionalism in the pastorate, the type of education, which we'll do a whole webinar on leader development, but decentralization and deprofessionalization have been two trends that you and I've talked about as well. And again, that's not because of COVID, but can you dive into those and how do we see COVID as even just speeding those things up?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at the early frontier church in America, but you also see this in Canada, but the church grew westward, right? I mean, it was the whole frontier expansion. Mm-hmm. And if you study both the Baptist and the Methodist movement, those were the fastest growing denominations. Like, they weren't denominations at the time, but the Baptist polity and Methodists, they weren't a denomination, they were a movement of the Anglican Church. But if you see that movement happen, push out westward and even towards the south in some cases, and definitely the north, it's predominantly in some ways lay movements. And so farmers that are going the town over, and then they're establishing churches as they're moving over. And there is a high level of alcoholism in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Churches in some ways were very engaged in that issue, obviously prohibition, those kinds of things. But prior to that, you see the church expanding primarily through bivocational church planters, farmers and frontier expanders. And so we've always had a version of that. If you study like the growth of denominations and the professionalism that begin to create the organizations, a lot of the structure that we developed came out of like our understanding of organizations that were developing out of the military, out of educational systems. AT&T was a huge influence on how we thought about organizational systems, eventually like IBM, those kinds of things. And so that began to really create ordination metrics. Eventually, the Southern Baptist became a convention. Eventually, United Methodist became a denomination. And I wouldn't say necessarily that was the bottleneck, but I would say in some ways it just makes sense. It's pretty easy to understand. The higher level of qualifications you have for somebody who can be in missional ministry, the less number of people that are going to be involved. The trick is we think in our mind there's a trade-off. Like, we think we have less ministers, but higher quality. But that's not always been true. The church has always been messy. It's always been, theologically, challenged by new movements. And so what COVID has actually, I think, presented us an opportunity with. And this is where I really appreciate the work of SOMA, because I think for SOMA and Saturate, what you all have done in the last 15 years or so has really laid the groundwork for people, if they wanted to, empower, quote unquote, lay leaders to lead missionally in their communities. And that really was the opportunity that we had with COVID, especially early on in the pandemic, where quickly the churches that knew this were quickly equipping moms and dads to be missional leaders in their home, and then also to become missional leaders in their community, which is a decentralized form of church. Mm-hmm. And we actually walked through several cohorts of hundreds of pastors of just helping them to reimagine their church as a decentralized network, because that was the opportunity that was in front of them. And I don't know, Ben, I mean, I'll be honest with you, I don't know how much of it really sunk in with folks. I think early on in the pandemic, I think most people were just kind of hunkering down and waiting to get back together in the fall or late summer. And then some have really taken it to heart to reimagine their systems and their processes for a more decentralized church. Because again, what it really is, and it's less about form, it's more about function. What it really means is the priesthood of all believers. Like, how do we get to that? How do we really get to that? And for those who spent a lot of their spring and summer empowering emerging leaders and, developing, house churches or, watch parties in homes and teaching their people how to be hosts and be hospitable, I think those churches may see, some incredible fruit coming out of the pandemic.
Yeah, that's interesting. And your comment about not knowing how much it's sinking in. I've been playing with this thought of, for the entire generation that we've grown up in, whether folks grew up in church or, became part of churches in adult life, all we've known is kind of this church growth movement, started in the 60s or so. Very much, and started from a good motive of we want people to know Jesus. How can we get them to know Jesus? Let's get them in the door. And we think that's just the water Christianity's already swam in because it's what we know. But for the first, 1960 years or so, like that wasn't the nature of the church. The professionalization, make sure everything is a good product so that people will want to come. That's not really part of the church's DNA. But just the shift in my mind has been really intriguing of going, yeah, but for everyone, and that's, 60 years. That's all we've known. And so anyone in ministry right now, for the most part, has been in those waters. And so any kind of shift feels more overt, and the kind of shifts that we're seeing with COVID that Soma Saturate's working with at Send Institutes, trying to bring people into those shifts. It almost took something really big to go like, oh, this isn't how Christianity's always operated. And the input metrics, we can't measure input metrics as well anymore. The professionals going, oh, what do I do if a lot of my work was this specific area of a Sunday morning? I can't do the programmatic area of a Sunday morning anymore. Even the institutionalization of churches starting to look very similar to one another, no matter the denomination or this kind of stuff. I don't know if you're seeing this, but a lot of churches are taking on kind of their own personalities, not different for difference's sake, but going like, hey, these are our people. We're paying maybe some more attention to who our people are and what their needs are, and this is the specific context or community that we're planted in or ministering in. And so we're starting to see, I think, some churches take on a little bit more uniqueness based on
Is that Ben or is that me? Sonny, can you still hear me? Okay, all right. Well, I'll keep going as Ben gets set up here. Sorry about that. At first, I thought it might have been me, but it looks like it might be Ben. So, But I think Ben's making a really good point there. And for those of you who are leading churches that are part of denominations and networks, you also realize that some of the struggles right now is how do you support churches that are trying to be more decentralized? And so as a denominational leader or a network leader, what does it look like to support micro churches, missional communities? And this is a huge question right now. As a matter of fact, the more that we work with denominations and with networks, that this is one of the major questions that people are asking. Is we realize this trend. We realize that we need to be able to. Hey Ben, I'm trying to pick up where you left off there. So
Great, you're good. Yeah.
And,
First time that's happened on a webinar.
Yeah, part of the knowledge base that larger institutions like denominations and networks don't yet have is how do you start, grassroots, micro missional communities that are sustainable, that are not reliant on the professional clergy, because so much of our institutions and our networks are built for people that want to be in full-time ministry. And so I think this is a necessary, healthy tension. And, I don't think we're saying get away with, let's do away with people who are full-time in ministry. Like that's, not for a second are we saying that. But I love what Hugh Halter says, because Hugh says, it's okay if you're, receiving a salary for ministry, but if you are receiving a salary for ministry, it should be because you're equipping believers for the work of the ministry and you're not just doing the ministry yourself. So.
Yeah, thank you for picking that up. And I cut out an unfortunate time. There's some really good things that came from the last 60 years for sure. And so we're not trying to just anti everything, but it has caused us to ask the question of the what's and the whys.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and a part of this is, the missional church conversation that's been happening, I think has, at times it pushed back against the church growth movement, but I see in some ways, like there's almost a coming of age of both of them right now. And I think COVID is like this thing where it's saying, can you guys work together? Mm-hmm. Like, can the church growth ideas and the missional movement ideas, can you work together to move to create a better future? And one case in point for, something that I think should give a lot of people inspiration, especially if you lead a larger church, is I think it's okay to share this, but the guys here in Chicagoland, Dave Ferguson, John Ferguson community, obviously they're always trying their best to be on the front edge of innovation. And, they're a larger church with, several campuses, but in the midst of COVID, they started wrestling with this idea of like, how do we actually empower people? Like, how do we just give away resources? How do we empower people? So they came up with, this conviction that, we're going to start a network for missional communities. So it would be an auxiliary, or it would be a parallel ministry to their kind of, traditional church. But they want to create the resources. They want to create the leadership pipeline. They want to create the infrastructure so that if you wanted to start a house church, you could, and you would be connected to their network and their community. And, I think that's a perfect time, again, for that kind of like larger traditional church growth mentality to work with the missional folks to create more models for the future.
Yeah, that's good. So a lot of this is about creativity, and it's about, not moving away from theology or principles, but just looking at practices and innovation and this kind of stuff. I want to ask kind of a two-sided question, then we'll get to some Q&A. One, kind of what's common pushback against those kind of shifts, and concurrently, what's at risk if we're not willing to pursue some of that creativity?
Yeah. So the pushback with decentralized models typically is around, theological heresy, those kinds of things. How do you guard doctrine? How do you guard theology? And that's a legitimate concern. If you talk to anybody who leads a decentralized movement, they have faced that, especially in our current climate in North America. There's a breadth of theology, and so that's always a concern. But I would say that's always going to be a concern. That's a concern in hierarchical institutional churches as well. We see that with the United Methodist Church right now. I mean, it's playing out right before our eyes. They're a very structured hierarchical institution, and they are dealing with the same issues. if you think about the Southern Baptists, if you think about the early Methodist movements, all the free church movements, evangelical free, Lutheran, all those movements, they were all a movement of decentralization, and they all faced, challenges of heresy. And the Holy Spirit has a way of just guarding and protecting the gospel. And so I think in some ways, you have to be okay with some of that when you push towards a more decentralized model. And then probably, secondly is sometimes people want to innovate for innovation's sake. And, and I'm one of those. Like, I'm just kind of like, let's give it a try and see what happens. But I think in some ways, that can often lead to fragmentation, into splintering, into lack of collaboration. And so I do think that if we can see further decentralization happen through collaboration, that will protect against some of the splintering. Yeah. And so I think that's really important. Some of the risks, if we don't really move and we really don't think about leadership of the future. I mean, I think I tried to set that up right at the very beginning. Like, for every generation that is not taking this seriously, that's an increasing burden for the next generation. Like, let me just go back. I mean, I know we want to get to Q&A, but let me take you back to that screen. Everybody knows this. You know this. Like, we've been saying this for decades. Is my screen? Let's see. Okay, you see my screen, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, everybody knows this. Like, this is not new information. But if you look at that trend of North America, okay, we're in 2020 here. I mean, there is some growth here. I mean, it's significantly, it's what, 20 million or so are here. But you see that trajectory with Europe here, and in some ways we're kind of where Europe is. We're going to where Europe is about 30 years ago. Like, I guess what we need to really grapple with is, and this is why I said everything we do is in the context of the global church. Leslie Newbegin raised the question back in the 1980s. He says, can the West be converted? Europe, North America. And the experiment for the last 30 years is, how does the West convert the West? I don't think that's the right answer to the solution. I think it's, how is the world going to convert the West? Because we are in the context of the global church, and the hope for the future of the church, and it has been for the last 20 years, have been those who have immigrated here and are planting churches. So
that's good. All right, let's kind of jump off from that, even in some of the decentralized conversation. Question is, do you feel bivocational ministry is the future of the church? This is from Michael. And if so, what things need to fall by the wayside of how we do church right now? You mentioned a couple of things about that second part, but yeah, are we headed toward bivocation?
Yes. And I would also argue that, bivocational has always been there. I mean, it's always been a thing. Most church planners, I mean, Ben, you probably know, you work with a lot of church planners. Most church planners are bivocational, it's hard to raise funds. And so I think the stigmatization around bivocational is probably being reduced, and friends like, Brad Briscoe and others that are brilliant in having this co-vocational conversation, that's, kind of putting more dignity in that idea of bivo. I think that trend is going to continue to increase, and it's actually going to call other people into mission, because they realize that I don't need to be, a seminary trained. So I think some of the things that need to fall by the wayside is the only imagination for church planting and leading ministry is that, having that one maverick, like, super skilled person to do it. I still think we need visionaries. I still think you need leadership and accountability. But there have been church planting movements all around the world, and here even in North America, that wasn't reliant on that one maverick personality. As a matter of fact, a lot of the immigrant churches that have been planted over the last 40 years have been families coming together and figuring out, team leadership. And so in some ways, the APES model is reinvigorating these team leadership dynamics.
Yeah. And I'll just add to that, if I can. I've been bivo for 19 years, intentionally so. And it started from a financial thing, like Daniel mentioned, but man, there's too many benefits that we've experienced. Not the only way, but there's a ton of benefits that would take too long to list. But a couple of them are just even being forced out on mission. If all of my time was able to go to the church, then there was some missional integrity like I would have lost, and God opened really sweet doors by, I was at a university campus, so working there. Yeah, and so that, and then just even what Daniel mentioned, like being forced in some ways to let go of God's church, trust some of the ministry to teammates and that kind of stuff. There's this myriad of benefit that can come from there, and some of that's just now being considered for the first time.
Yeah.
Question from John: what are some things that must not change in the future? And this could be anything from biblical fidelity, honoring tradition, while still adapting and contextualizing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you definitely hit it on the head there. I think some things that shouldn't change in terms of discipleship making, I think it really still comes down to the formation of Jesus in people and in communities. I think the reliance on the Holy Spirit, I mean, there's a reason why the Pentecostal church has exploded all around the world, and it's not because of the charismatic gifts. Sometimes that's what people perceive it to be, but it's not that. It's a desperation and a spiritual discipline that people have in certain parts of the world where God has just come down with fire, and I think in some ways we've seen that in North America in different seasons. And so our spiritual disciplines of prayer and fasting, I think are, Ben, I think one of the greatest things that maybe it's not too late, but I don't know if we really capitalized on when the pandemic came was prayer and fasting.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know if our response was, I know for a fact the pastor's response primarily initially March, April was how do we get services online, which is a legitimate, logistical thing. But it was not overwhelmingly a response of like repentance and, of prayer and, and we saw some movements of prayer. I know Seattle had some movements of prayer. Chicago, we had a movement of prayer. But I don't know if that has sustained through the pandemic. And I think in some ways that should never change about the church. And then I still think that polity is important. And I think that, again, this is maybe one of the pushbacks that decentralized movements will sometimes get is church polity. And I still, without prescribing any particular one, I still think that, when you follow the New Testament, polity was important. But polity was important because movement was happening. And my pet peeve is that for some people, polity is important, but there's no movement happening amongst them. Like, we've become professionals in polity, but we have no movement to really steward. And so Bob has always been, for me, he helped me to understand this. He said elders were appointed, bishops and episcopals were appointed because the church was exploding and it needed to have guardrails. And so I think when we major on polity, we might be in trouble. So.
Yeah, and Bob there is our mutual friend, Bob Roberts Jr., I believe is who you were referencing there.
That's right, yep.
Yeah, it's a trellis or vine question. In some ways, if we build a trellis with no vine happening, then something's off there.
That's right.
Couple of related questions. Do we know why churches are planning across the globe? Do we see trend? Do you have any resources even on Friends? There's one specific question. Do you have recommendations on African church growth causes? Yeah, so just kind of try to summarize those questions.
If you're looking for large scale, like the big picture stuff, anything by Philip Jenkins, he's probably, one of the leading voices. I mentioned Lamin Sane, who he just passed last year, tremendous scholar. So any one of these, Tianu, that's Tienou, another African, but also he's now an American scholar. So those three names would probably get you some significant, understanding. And then if you go to Lausanne's Diaspora Network, they're charting some of the more recent stuff. Sam George, who's a colleague of mine, he's Indian American. Sam George is his name. A lot of his stuff would probably resonate. And his stuff about the Indian church right now is amazing. You understand that the Indian church is not just growing in India. It's growing all over London, North America here, Canada, where I was at, the Indian church. In some ways, the Indian church is like almost followed the trajectory of the Filipino church. It's just moved into the cracks and crevices of every continent. So.
Hot take follow-up on that. Should the U.S. church be spending more energy outside the U.S. then, as far as planting and resources and this kind of stuff? Or since we're saying, hey, we're learning from some of those things, should we be maybe reclaiming even some redirecting of resources in the U.S. For that kind of planting, looking toward 2050?
Yeah. It's a struggle for a lot of mission agencies. I mean, there are a lot of denominations that are combining their foreign and their home mission boards. It's been a conversation for a lot of people because they realize that the world has shrunk. And, so for instance, in, Southern Baptists, you now have some, not a lot, but you have some IMB missionaries that work in North America, and so in some ways, the strategies are getting closer to each other, but I still think there's some delineation there. And I still think that there is some theological and biblical precedent for crossing cultures and boundaries. And I don't think we should think about it as overseas as much anymore, because that used to be the predominant stumbling block was transportation. Because you got to think about this, man. Modern mission movement back in the early when it started, William Carey, and even before that, London Missionary Society, people would travel months on a ship to get to like this remote Polynesian island, and so it was overseas ministries, right? That was like 250 years ago. Like we don't have those stumbling blocks anymore. So in some ways, I think the conversation is still the same, but it's very different. And I think we should learn as much. We should resource back and forth. Sometimes it's finances, sometimes it's theological resources. Yeah.
Great. If large churches, speaking of resource, if large churches are going to continue to have a place moving forward, how can they see church planting as valuable, sending people out being a positive thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where I really do appreciate the leadership of some prominent pastors. I'm more of an optimist than I'm a pessimist. So, like, I really think that there's some bad pastors, but I think there are really good pastors too. That they're not out there for their own gain and their own platform. And I really do admire the leaders that are really now at this point really rethinking, okay, how do we actually, number one, if we're multi-site, how do we autonomize for the purpose of more impact? So that trend already started before COVID, but I think right now a lot of larger churches are actually thinking about autonomizing sites because of of that. And then, the flip side of that is sometimes adopting churches that are getting ready to close. Like, I think we need to see more of that, Ben. I mean, I am all for revitalizing and replanting, and larger churches are gifted in doing that sometimes. And so I think, if they could do that tastefully and not feel like they're, colonizing a particular neighborhood, I think a New Life Church here in Chicago, they do a really good job at that. And then probably, some of the other things that I really do think, I think this is a trend for the future, is that larger churches will provide theological education. I think the ministry training, theological education, maybe not necessarily ordination, unless you're Southern Baptist, that could probably happen. But I think that basic theological training is going to happen more and more at the local church level, if not local churches, family of churches. And we're seeing it happen across North America already.
Yeah, we're going to dive into that part on a future webinar. I'm going to try to get to one, maybe two more, but this is maybe not just a 30-second answer for this one, but picking up on some of your comments about immigrant planting and multi-ethnic church. Seems like Black churches, I'm just going to read this. It seems like Black churches, Hispanic churches, Korean churches, etc., are viewed positively as unique cultural expressions of Christianity, while white churches are viewed more negatively because of a lack of cultural diversity. Kind of address, and I've had a little bit of this conversation, address kind of how much of that is walking along culturally familiar lines, homogenous kind of stuff, and even the desire. Is there a desire in multiple ethnic pockets for diversity?
Yeah, it is a big question. I mean, I think in some ways we'll need language specific churches, and so maybe what sometimes a lot of people don't fully understand is that most Hispanic churches are multi-ethnic churches. Guatemalans, Ecuadorians,
Yeah, yeah.
Peruvians, they're all, Puerto Ricans, they're not the same. So language specific churches, I think, are still going to be legitimate boundary markers for some people. I think those that have, we have African theology because of African churches. And so I think in some ways, there are going to be these sociological markers. I think the attitudes behind them are going to be most important, though. What are the reasons for why you remain a culturally confined church? And if they're biblical, then I think, we need to have more. But if we get to a point, and again, I can't discern this for every congregation. Every congregation has to discern this for themselves. I do agree that sometimes white churches get the bad rep when it comes to being a predominantly white church. But I think the origins for some of that, Ben, I mean, you know this and I know this, the origin for some of that is because when churches began integrating, there were large numbers of churches that refused to integrate. So as a matter of fact, I can show you a black and white picture of a church from the 50s that held up a sign that says, integrating our church is communism. And so there's a history of that. So that is some of the perception. And then also the white flight that happened in the 70s, where whites were leaving the urban areas and they were commuting in for church, and they were not as concerned about their changing community. I think those are the two things that had created a reputation that I am all for helping, to overcome. But a part of that is we have to get more nuance and become better in the conversation. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, no, and thank you for digging into that again. It's something that you mentioned in some of your statistics and trends earlier. And also we can all acknowledge it's a one small piece of a much bigger historical puzzle and this kind of stuff. And so a full-on answer would be its own webinar. But as it relates to your specific portion from earlier, Daniel, thank you for going there. So I'm going to wrap us up. So there's lots to ponder there. There's so much more. I mean, there's so many more trends even in this kind of stuff that we could have dived into further and further. But man, this has been so helpful. And for those watching, those who will listen and watch later, just even maybe if the consideration of something that you feel needing to be different. I hope today gave you some freedom to go, maybe God might actually be moving us into some of those things. And one thing looking different doesn't mean we have to look away from biblical fidelity, from gospel and prayer and dependence on God and this kind of stuff. In fact, sometimes change leads us to more dependence and prayer and reliance on God. So as a related resource, I'd be remiss not to mention that a new season of the Saturate podcast kicked off with Jeff Vanderstelt and Duke Rivard hosting. And the first episode is considering what COVID is doing to America's ecclesiology. And to Raul's question, which we didn't specifically get to, another episode of that is with the guys from Christ Together, which is an organization that Daniel and Ben have worked with, that I've worked with. And they're asking the question of being the church together in the city. And so the Saturate podcast could help answer some questions we didn't get to in this webinar as well. Of course, loads of past webinars, even some that relate to race and politics and some other questions we didn't get to that were posted in the Q&A. And Saturate also just introduced our first ever collection of digital courses to serve you in some of these areas. So all of that is at saturatetheworld.com. And I'll close with this. If today was kind of a high level, here's where we're headed. 2050 is looming, but also there's a lot of hope there. Every other week until Thanksgiving, at least US Thanksgiving, the Saturate webinars are going to look at specific elements of this kind of broad brush strokes that Daniel and I painted today. So I hope you'll join me and Todd Engstrom and Linda Bergquist and British sociologist Stuart Murray. Daniel talked about learning from the UK and Europe, and so Stuart Murray is going to join us. He's a fantastic thinker. Brad Watson, Winfield Bevins, some SOMA leaders from across North America as we continue the conversation we started with Daniel today. So I hope you'll register for our September 29th, Church of the Future webinar. But that's it for today. Daniel, thank you so much.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks to you all. God bless you.
Yeah, and everybody else, thank you too. We'll see you next time.